all the entire thing a week, a month, even a decade later. He could do the same for lists of words, for poems, for short reading selections, in his native Russian and in languages that were completely foreign to him, like Italian. Laurier's extensive interviews with S about his memory, detailed in his book The Mind of a Mnemonist, revealed that S had a condition called synesthesia, in which perceptions are mixed and unusually vivid. Sounds have shapes, colors, letters have taste, fragrance. Even numbers remind me of images, S told Laurier. Take the number 1. This is a proud, well-built man. 2 is a high-spirited woman, 3 a gloomy person. As for the number 87, what I see is a fat woman and a man twirling his moustache. He attached an unusual number of cues to each thing he memorized, including internally generated images and details of the learning environment, like the sound of Laurier's voice. Chereshevsky's recall of words, numbers, and voices was so complete, in fact, that often one performance encroached on another performance, especially when they occurred in the same place, with no difference in context. He had to work to block related material. Writing something down means I'll know I won't have to remember it, he told Laurier. So I started doing this with small matters like phone numbers, last names, errands of one sort or another. But I got nowhere, for in my mind I continued to see what I've written. He lacked a normal forgetting filter, and it often frustrated him. Laurier had Chereshevsky study one of his number-letter matrices on May 10, 1939. S examined it for 3 minutes. After a short break, he could recite it without error, row by row, column by column, or along the diagonals. Several months later, Laurier tested him again, without warning, on the same table. The only difference in the two performances was that for the latter one he needed more time to revive the entire situation in which the experiment had originally been carried out. Laurier wrote. 2. See the room in which we had been sitting, to hear my voice. 2. Reproduce an image of himself looking at the board. S re-inhabited the May 10th study session to bring back the matrix. Chereshevsky was a prodigy, and his methods are largely off-limits to the rest of us. We can't revive our study surroundings in nearly so much detail, and even if we could, there's no chance that the entire table would scroll back up in pristine clarity. Our minds don't work in the same way. Yet S's use of multiple perceptions, audio, visual, sensual, hints at how we can capitalize on context. We can easily multiply the number of perceptions connected to a given memory, most simply, by varying where we study. How much could a simple change in venue aid recall? In the mid-1970s, a trio of psychologists performed an experiment to answer that question. Stephen Smith, Robert Bjork, and another psychologist, Arthur Glenberg, all then at the University of Michigan, wondered what would happen if people studied the same material twice, only in 2 different places. They presented a group of students with a list of 44-letter words, like ball and fork. Half the students studied the words in 2 10-minute sessions, a few hours apart, either in the same small, cluttered, basement room or in a neat windowed room looking out on a courtyard. The other half studied the words in 2 settings, once in that small, windowless room and again in the neat windowed one overlooking the courtyard. 2 groups. The same words. In the same order. The same amount of time. One group in the same environment both times, the other in 2 distinct ones. I considered myself, the experimenter, part of the environment, too, Smith told me. In the windowless, basement room I looked like I usually did, long wild hair, flannel shirt, construction boots. In the modern conference room, I had my hair slicked back, I wore a tie, I had on the suit my dad wore to my bar mitzvah. Some of the students who studied in both places thought I was a different guy. After the second session the students rated each word on whether it evoked positive or negative associations. This was a ruse, to give them the impression that they were done with those words, that there was no reason to think about or practice them. In fact, they weren't done. In the third phase of the experiment, 3 hours later, researchers had the students write down as many of the words as they could in 10 minutes. This test occurred in a third, neutral room, a regular classroom. There was no reinstatement, as in previous context studies. The third room was one that the participants hadn't been in before and was nothing like the other two where they had studied. The difference in scores was striking. The one-room group recalled an average of 16 of the 40 studied words. The two-rooms group recalled 24. A simple change in venue improved retrieval strength by 40%. Or, as the authors put it, the experiment showed strong recall improvements with variation of environmental context. No one knows for sure why changing rooms could be better for recall than staying put. One possibility is that the brain encodes one subset of the words in one room, and a slightly different set in the other. Those two subsets overlap, and two subsets are better than one. Or it may be that rehearsing in two rooms doubles the number of contextual cues linked to any single word, fact, or idea being studied. In one room, the beige walls, fluorescent lighting, and clutter of stacked books color the memory of the word fork. In the other, fork is intertwined with the natural light pouring through the window, the sight of an old oak in the courtyard, the hum of an air conditioner. The material is embedded in two sensory layers, and that could give the brain at least one more opportunity to revive what it can of the study conditions and retrieve the words, or concepts. If door number 1 doesn't work, it can try door number 2. We do this sort of perspective shifting all the time when, say, trying to remember the name of an actor. We pull up scenes from his most recent movie, there's his face, but no name. We recall his face in the newspaper, his cameo on a TV show, maybe even a time we saw him on stage. We use multiple mental lenses to tease out the name and, in general, more detail. Smith has since gone digital. He uses short video clips to create backgrounds, rather than herding students from room to room. In a typical experiment, he divides participants into two groups. One studies, say, 20 words in Swahili over 5 practice sessions of 10 minutes each. The words appear on a movie screen, one at a time, transposed over a single, soundless background clip in all 5 sessions. This is the same environment condition. The other group studies the identical words, also over 5 10-minute sessions, only those words appear over a different video background during each practice period. A visual simulation, no more. Yet on tests taken 2 days later, the varied background group came out ahead, remembering an average of 16 of the Swahili words, compared to 9 or 10 for the one background group. I have to admit I'm a sucker for this stuff. I love studies like these, because I can't sit still for more than 20 minutes to study, if that. I want to believe that this kind of restlessness can deepen learning, and I often wish that the evidence for context variation was a little more airtight. The research has a meandering feel to it, to be honest. Scientists are still debating which cues matter most, when, and how strong they really are. Because context effects are subtle, they're hard to reproduce in experiments. The definition of context, for that matter, is a moving target. If it includes moods, movement, and background music, it could by extension mean any change in the way we engage our vocabulary lists, history chapters, or Spanish homework. Think about it. Writing notes by hand is one kind of activity, typing them using a keyboard is another. The same goes for studying while standing up versus sitting down, versus running on a treadmill. Daniel Willingham, a leading authority on the application of learning techniques in classrooms, advises his own students, when they're reviewing for an exam, not to work straight from their notes. I tell them to put the notes aside and create an entirely new outline, reorganizing the material, he told me. It forces you to think about the material again, and in a different way. Isn't how we do something part of the environment, too? It is. Yet the larger message of context research is that, in the end, it doesn't much matter which aspects of the environment you vary, so long as you vary what you can. The philosopher John Locke once described the case of a man who had learned to dance by practicing according to a strict ritual, always in the same room, which contained an old trunk. Unfortunately, wrote Locke, The idea of this remarkable piece of household stuff had so mixed itself with the turns and steps of all his dances, that though in that chamber he could dance excellently well, yet it was only when that trunk was there. He could not perform well in any other place unless that or some other trunk had its due position in the room. This research says, take the trunk out of the room. Since we cannot predict the context in which we'll have to perform, we're better off varying the circumstances in which we prepare. We need to handle life's pop quizzes, its spontaneous pick-up games and jam sessions, and the traditional advice to establish a strict practice routine is no way to do so. On the contrary, try another room altogether. Another time of day. Take the guitar outside, into the park, into the woods. Change cafes. Switch practice courts. Put on blues instead of classical. Each alteration of the routine further enriches the skills being rehearsed, making them sharper and more accessible for a longer period of time. This kind of experimenting itself reinforces learning, and makes what you know increasingly independent of your surroundings. Chapter 4, Spacing Out. The advantage of breaking up study time. The oldest learning technique in memory science is also one of the most powerful, reliable, and easy to use. Psychologists have known about it for more than 100 years and proven that it works to deepen the learning of subject areas or skills that call for rote memorization, like foreign vocabulary, scientific terms and concepts, equations, or musical scales. Yet mainstream education has largely ignored it. Few schools teach it as part of the regular curriculum. Few students even know about it, except as the sort of motherly advice that's safe to ignore. Honey, don't you think it would be better to study for a little bit tonight and a little bit tomorrow, rather than trying to learn everything at once? The technique is called distributed learning or, more commonly, the spacing effect. People learn at least as much, and retain it much longer, when they distribute, or space, their study time than when they concentrate it. Mom's right, it is better to do a little today and a little tomorrow rather than everything at once. Not just better, a lot better. Distributed learning, in certain situations, can double the amount we remember later on. This isn't to say that cramming is useless. The all-nighter is time-tested, with a long track record of improving exam scores the next day. In terms of reliability, though, this nocturnal sprint is a little like overstuffing a cheap suitcase. The contents hold for a while, then everything falls out. Researchers who study learning say the result from habitual cramming can be dramatic from one semester to the next. The students who do it arrive for the second term, and they don't remember anything from the first term. Henry Roediger III, a psychologist at Washington University in St. Louis, told me. It's like they never took the class. The spacing effect is especially useful for memorizing new material. Try it yourself with 2 lists of, say, 15 phone numbers or Russian vocabulary words. Study one list for 10 minutes today and 10 minutes tomorrow, and the other for 20 minutes tomorrow. Wait a week and test yourself to see how many of the total from both lists you can remember. Now go back to the 2 lists. The difference in what you recalled from each should be significant, and there's no obvious explanation for it. I like to think of the spacing effect in terms of lawn care in Los Angeles. LA is a city with a coastal desert climate and cultural commitment to the pristine lawn. I learned while living there for 7 years that, to maintain one of those, it's far more effective to water for 30 minutes 3 times a week than for an hour and a half once a week. Flooding the lawn makes it look slightly more lush the next day, but that emerald gloss fades, sure enough. A healthy dose every couple days and you can look your neighbors in the eye, while using the same amount of water, or even less. Same goes for distributed learning. You're not spending any more time. You're not working any harder. But you remember more for longer. A principle this powerful should have had a quick, clean ride from the lab into classrooms. What student wouldn't want to enhance learning without putting in any extra time or effort? It hasn't happened, and for good reasons. One is that, as parents know too well, it's enough of a chore to get students to sit down for single study sessions, never mind multiple ones. The other is that for much of the last 100 years psychologists have, exasperatingly, inexplicably, confined the study of spacing to short lab experiments. It is as if doctors discovered a cure for diabetes and spent 50 years characterizing its molecular structure before giving it to a patient. Only in the last several years have researchers mapped out the best intervals to use when spacing study time. Is it more efficient to study a little bit today and a little bit tomorrow, or to do so every other day, or once a week? What if it's Tuesday, and the history final is on Friday? What if the exam is a month away? Do the spacing intervals change depending on the exam date? I see the history of distributed learning as an object lesson in how to interpret research, especially the kind that's discussed in this book. The culture of science is to build on previous experimental evidence, to test, replicate, and extend it if possible. That tradition is invaluable, because it gives scientists a shared language, a common set of tools, so that Dr. Smith in Glasgow knows what Dr. Jones in Indianapolis is talking about when she describes the results of a paired associates test in a research paper. Without that lingua franca, no field could build a foundation of agreed open findings. Researchers would be following their own intuitions, inventing their own tests and tools, creating a swarm of results that might, or might not, be related to one another. That tradition can be binding, however, and it kept the spacing effect under wraps, confined for decades to discussion in arcane journals. Breaking that confinement took, to varying degrees, the social upheaval caused by the Vietnam War, the work of a dogged Polish teenager, and the frustration of a senior researcher who said, essentially, how can I use this in my own life? That's a question we all should ask of any science purporting to improve learning. And it helped transform the spacing effect from a lab curiosity to something we can actually exploit. We've already met Hermann Ebbinghaus, the man who gave learning science its first language. That language was nonsense syllables, and Ebbinghaus spent much of his adult life inventing them, reshuffling them, arranging them into short lists, long lists, studying those lists for 15 minutes, a half hour, longer, then turning around and testing himself, carefully checking each test against the original list and study duration. He kept intricate records, logged everything into equations, doubled back and checked those equations, and then reloaded and tried different schedules of memorization, including spaced study. He found that he could learn a list of 12 syllables, repeating them flawlessly, if he performed 68 repetitions on one day and 7 more on the next. Yet he could do just as well with only 38 repetitions total if they were spaced out over 3 days. With any considerable number of repetitions, he wrote, a suitable distribution of them over a space of time is decidedly more advantageous than the massing of them at a single time. It was the field's founder, then, who discovered the power of spacing. The scientist who picked up the ball next would set the tone for a generation of research that barely moved forward an inch. Adolf Jost, an Austrian psychologist known mostly for advocating eugenics, did his own studies of spacing, also with nonsense syllables, and in 1897 formulated what became known as Jost's law: if two associations are of equal strength but of different age, a new repetition has a greater value for the older one. Translation: studying a new concept right after you learn it doesn't deepen the memory much, if at all. Studying it an hour later, or a day later, does. Jost basically repeated one of Ebbinghaus's experiments, found the very same thing, and got a law out of it, with his name attached. He managed to sound like he was extending the research without really doing so. Other psychologists followed suit, first testing more nonsense syllables and gradually graduating to lists of words or word pairs. In a way, the science went backward in the first half of the 20th century. The psychologists who followed Jost launched scores of experiments with small numbers of people studying grouped or spaced items over intervals of minutes or even seconds, getting so lost in minutiae that by 1960 the research had succeeded mostly in showing that the spacing effect worked during very short time periods. If you're told, 3 times, in succession, that James Monroe was the 5th President of the United States, you remember it for a while. If you're told it 3 times, at 10-minute intervals, you remember it for longer. And it's nice to know if you're preparing for a trivia contest against your 10-year-old brother, But this focus on short intervals left a large question unanswered. Can spaced practice help people build and maintain a base of knowledge that's useful in school and in life? In the 1970s, a growing number of psychologists began asking just that, sensing that a big idea was being squandered. Some were questioning the field's entire research tradition, including its faith in the methods of Ebbinghaus. This all began happening during the Vietnam War protests, when students and young people were questioning authority across the board. Harry P. Barrick, a psychologist at Ohio Wesleyan University, told me. That was what set these questions into motion, and people started speaking up. We spent all these years genuflecting to the giants in the field, and what did we have to show for it? Teachers and students don't care about how many words you do or don't remember in some 10-minute test taken in a lab. They want to know how spacing affects how well you learn French or German, how well you pick up math and science concepts. We couldn't tell them. We had to do something completely different. Barrick wasn't interested in extending lab findings. He wanted to blow the doors open and let in some air. He wanted to shake off the influence of Ebbinghaus, Jost, and the old guard and test long intervals, of weeks, months, years, the time periods relevant to lifetime learning. How does distributed learning contribute to building mastery of, say, auto mechanics or music skills? Does it help at all, or are the benefits negligible? To answer that convincingly, he would have to test acquisition of the kind of knowledge that people couldn't get casually, at work, by reading the paper, or from friends. He chose foreign language. For the experiment he had in mind, his test subjects couldn't be just anyone, either. He had to find people who would stick with the experiment for years, who would not quit or fall out of touch, who would not misrepresent their effort, and who, ideally, could supervise their own studying. He settled on his wife and kids. The Barricks are a family of psychologists. His wife, Phyllis, a therapist, and his daughters, Lorraine and Audrey, both academic researchers, would be ideal subjects. I'm not sure it's something they wanted to do, but I think they wanted to please me, Barrick, who included himself as participant number 4, told me. And over the years it became a fun family project. We always had something to talk about, and we talked about it a lot. The ground rules were as follows. Phyllis, Audrey, and Lorraine would study French vocabulary words, and Harry would study German. He compiled lists of 300 unfamiliar words per person, and each Barrick split his or her list into 6 groups of 50 and studied each of those groups according to a different schedule. For one list, it was once every 2 weeks, for another, it was once every month, for a third, it was once every 2 months. They used flashcards, with French or German on one side and English on the other, and drilled themselves in each session until they remembered the meaning of all the words on that list. It was a chore much of the time. It was tedious. No one was being paid for all that study time. But it was also a start. The first truly long-term test of the spacing effect, the 4-Barrick study, as they called it, was underway. The best foreign language program in the world is what I call the James method. To implement this program, simply follow the example of the American writers Henry and William James and grow up the child of wealthy, cultured parents who see to it that throughout your childhood you travel widely in Europe and the Americas and receive language tutoring along the way. The Jameses were determined that their sons have what Henry S.R. called a sensuous education. The most famous of the siblings, the novelist Henry, studied with tutors in Paris, Bologna, Geneva, and Bonn. He spent extended time in each place and returned periodically throughout his life. As a result, he became proficient in French, Italian, and German. The James method integrates foreign language and first-rate instruction into childhood development. That's not quite the same as growing up in a multilingual home, but it's a pretty close facsimile. Children absorb a new language quickly when forced to speak and understand it, when living with it, and that is what the James children did to some extent. They had to memorize non-English verbs and nouns like the rest of us, but did so at a time when the language modules in their brain were still developing. A nice gig if you can get it. If not, if you spent your childhood closer to Geneva, Ohio, or Paris, Texas, and want to learn Farsi, you're at a spectacular disadvantage. You've got some not so sensual memorizing to do, and a lot of it, in relative isolation. There is no other way, no trick or secret code. Consider learning English as a foreign language, a challenge that millions of people around the world face if they want a certain type of job, in the sciences certainly, but also in government, in sectors of the digital economy, in tourism and trade. An educated English speaker knows 20 to 30,000 words, along with hundreds of idioms and expressions. Stockpiling half that many words is a tall order when you're starting from scratch. By one estimate, it takes roughly 2 hours of practice a day for 5 or so years to do so. And storing those words is only one part of the job. Remember, from the forget to learn theory, storage and retrieval are two different things. Just because you've studied the word epitome doesn't mean it's retrievable when you read or hear it. To build fluency, to keep this ever-expanding dictionary readily accessible, usable in the moment, it takes more than the time needed to store them. How much more? In 1982, about the time that Baryk embarked on his family study, a 19-year-old Polish college student named Piotr Wozniak calculated an answer to that question based on his own experience: too much. At the rate he was going, Wozniak determined that he would have to study English 4 hours a day for years to become proficient enough to read scientific papers and converse with other scientists. He simply didn't have the time, not while carrying a load of computer science and biology courses. He'd have to find a more efficient system, if one existed, and the only experimental subject he had was himself. He began by building a database of about 3,000 words and 1,400 scientific facts in English that he was trying to absorb. He divided the total into 3 equal groups and started to study according to different schedules. He tried intervals of 2 days, 4 days, a week, 2 weeks, and so on. He kept detailed records to determine when newly learned words or facts began to defy recall. He began to see a pattern. He found that, after a single study session, he could recall a new word for a couple days. But if re-studied on the next day, the word was retrievable for about a week. After a third review session, a week after the second, the word was retrievable for nearly a month. He continued to refine the ideal intervals for keeping his English sharp, and programmed a computer to track his progress. These optimum intervals are calculated on the basis of 2 contradictory criteria. He wrote at the time. Intervals should be as long as possible to obtain the minimum frequency of repetitions, and to make the best use of the so-called spacing effect. Intervals should be short enough to ensure that the knowledge is still remembered. Before long, Wozniak was living and learning according to the rhythms of his system, applying it to all his subjects. The English experiment became an algorithm, then a personal mission, and finally, in 1987, he turned it into a software package called SuperMemo. SuperMemo teaches according to Wozniak's calculations. It provides digital flashcards and a daily calendar for study, keeping track of when words were first studied and representing them according to the spacing effect. Each previously studied word pops up on screen just before that word is about to drop out of reach of retrieval. It's easy to use and, after Wozniak made it available as freeware in the 1990s, the program took off, especially among young people trying to learn English in places like China and Poland. In effect, Wozniak had reinvented Ebbinghaus for the digital age. His algorithm answered a crucial question about the timing of intervals. To build and retain foreign vocabulary, scientific definitions, or other factual information, it's best to review the material 1 or 2 days after initial study, then a week later, then about a month later. After that, the intervals are longer. By 1992, researchers saw that what began as a lab curiosity in fact had enormous potential in education. One group had shown that teaching third graders addition once a day for 10 days was far more effective than twice a day for 5 days. Another had shown that middle school students learned biology definitions like cell, mitosis, and chromosome far better in spaced sessions than in a single class. and ever-expanding intervals, as per Supermemo, indeed appeared to be the most effective way to build a knowledge base, making the spacing effect one of the most remarkable phenomenon to emerge from laboratory research on learning. One reviewer, psychologist Frank N. Dempster, of the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, wrote, "The next year, in 1993, the Baric study appeared in the journal Psychological Science. If Wozniak helped establish the minimum intervals required to keep newly learned facts accessible, the Barics provided insight into the maximum intervals for lifetime learning. After 5 years, the family scored highest on the list they'd reviewed according to the most widely spaced, longest-running schedule, once every 2 months, for 26 sessions. They got 76% of those words on a final test, compared to 56% on a test of words studied once every 2 weeks for 26 sessions. In the beginning of the study, the 2-month wait meant they forgot a lot of words, compared to when they waited 2 weeks. That gap narrowed quickly. Remember, they practiced until they knew all the words on their list during each study session. By the end, the 2-month interval improved performance by 50%. Who knew?" Baric said. "I had no idea. I thought, in 2 months, I might forget everything." Why spaced study sessions have such a large impact on learning is still a matter of debate. Several factors are likely at work, depending on the interval. With very short intervals, seconds or minutes, as in the early studies, it may be that the brain becomes progressively less interested in a fact when it's repeated multiple times in rapid succession. It has just heard and stored the fact that James Monroe was the 5th president. If the same fact is repeated again, and then a third time, the brain pays progressively less attention. For intermediate intervals of days or weeks, other factors might come into play. Recall the forget-to-learn theory, which holds that forgetting aids learning in 2 ways, actively, by filtering out competing facts, and passively, in that some forgetting allows subsequent practice to deepen learning, like an exercised muscle. The example we used in Chapter 2 was meeting the new neighbors for the first time. You remember the names right after hearing them, as retrieval strength is high. Yet storage strength is low, and by tomorrow morning the names will be on the tip of your tongue, until you hear, from over the hedges, Justin, Maria, and you got 'em, at least for the next several days. That is to say, hearing the names again triggers a mental act, retrieval. Oh, that's right, Justin as in Timberlake and Maria as in Sharapova, which boosts subsequent retrieval strength higher than it previously was. A day has passed between workouts, allowing strength to increase. Spaced study, in many circumstances, including the neighbor example, also adds contextual cues, of the kind discussed in Chapter 3. You initially learned the names at the party, surrounded by friends and chatter, a glass of wine in hand. The second time, you heard them yelled out, over the hedges. The names are now embedded in 2 contexts, not just one. The same thing happens when reviewing a list of words or facts the second time. The effects described above are largely subconscious, running under the radar. We don't notice them. With longer intervals of a month or more, and especially with 3 or more sessions, we begin to notice some of the advantages that spacing allows, because they're obvious. For the Barics, the longer intervals helped them identify words they were most likely to have trouble remembering. With longer spaces, you're forgetting more, but you find out what your weaknesses are and you correct for them, Baric told me. You find out which mediators, which cues, which associations, or hints you used for each word, are working and which aren't. And if they're not working, you come up with new ones. When I first start studying difficult material that comes with a new set of vocabulary, new software, the details of health insurance, the genetics of psychiatric disorders, I can study for an hour and return the next day and remember a few terms. Practically nothing. The words and ideas are so strange at first that my brain has no way to categorize them, no place to put them. So be it. I now treat that first encounter as a casual walkthrough, a meet and greet, and put in just 20 minutes. I know that in round 2 I'll get more traction, not to mention round 3. I haven't used any more time, but I remember more. By the 1990s, after its long incubation period in the lab, the spacing effect had grown legs and filled out, and in the process showed that it had real muscle. Results from classroom studies continued to roll in. Spaced review improves test scores for multiplication tables, for scientific definitions, for vocabulary. The truth is, nothing in learning science comes close in terms of immediate, significant, and reliable improvements to learning. Still, spacing out had no operating manual. The same questions about timing remained. What is the optimal study interval given the test date? What's the timing equation? Does one exist? The people who have worked hardest to turn the spacing effect into a practical strategy for everyday learning have one thing in common: they're teachers, as well as researchers. If students are cramming and not retaining anything, it's not all their fault. A good class should make the material stick, and spaced review is one way to do that. Teachers already do some reviewing, of course, but usually according to instinct or as part of standard curriculum, not guided by memory science. I get sick of people taking my psych intro class and coming back next year and not remembering anything. Melody Wisehart, a psychologist at York University in Toronto, told me. It's a waste of time and money. People pay a lot for college. As a teacher, too, you want to teach so that people learn. And remember, that's your job. You certainly want to know when it's best to review key concepts. What's the best time, given the spacing effect, to revisit material? What is the optimal schedule for students preparing for a test? In 2008, a research team led by Wisehart and Harold Pashler, a psychologist at the University of California, San Diego, conducted a large study that provided the first good answer to those questions. The team enrolled 1,354 people of all ages, drawn from a pool of volunteers in the United States and abroad who had signed up to be remote research subjects, working online. Wisehart and Pashler's group had them study 32 obscure facts. What European nation consumes the most spicy Mexican food? Norway. Who invented snow golf? Rudyard Kipling. What day of the week did Columbus set sail for the New World in 1492? Friday. What's the name of the dog on the Cracker Jack box? Bingo. Each participant studied the facts twice, on 2 separate occasions. For some, the 2 sessions were only 10 minutes apart. For others, the interval was a day. For still another group, it was a month. The longest interval was 6 months. The researchers also varied the timing of the final exam. In total, there were 26 different study test schedules for the researchers to compare. The researchers compared all 26 different study schedules, and calculated the best intervals given different test dates. To put it simply, if you want to know the optimal distribution of your study time, you need to decide how long you wish to remember something, Wisehart and Pashler's group wrote. The optimal interval ranges can be read off a simple chart. Have a close look. These numbers aren't exact, there's wiggle room on either side. But they're close. If the test is in a week, and you want to split your study time in 2, then do a session today and tomorrow, or today and the day after tomorrow. If you want to add a third, study the day before the test. If the test is a month away, then the best option is today. A week from today, for a third, wait 3 more weeks or so, until a day before the test. The further away the exam, that is, the more the time you have to prepare, the larger the optimal interval between sessions 1 and 2. That optimal first interval declines as a proportion of the time to test, the Internet study found. If the test is in a week, the best interval is a day or 2. If it's in 6 months, the best interval is 3 to 5 weeks. Wait any longer between study sessions, and performance goes down fairly quickly. For most students, in college, high school, or middle school, Wisehart told me, it basically means you're working with intervals of 1 day, 2 days, or 1 week. That should take care of most situations. Let's take an example. Say there's a German exam in 3 months or so at the end of the semester. Most of us will spend at least 2 months of that time learning what it is we need to know for the exam, leaving at most a few weeks to review, if that. Let's say 15 days, that's our window. For convenience, let's give ourselves 9 hours total study time for that exam. The optimal schedule is the following: 3 hours on day 1, 3 hours on day 8, 3 hours on day 14, give or take a day. In each study session, we're reviewing the same material. On day 15, according to the spacing effect, we'll do at least as well on the exam, compared to 9 hours of cramming. The payoff is that we will retain that vocabulary for much longer, many months in this example. We'll do far better on any subsequent tests, like at the beginning of the following semester. And we'll do far better than cramming if the exam is delayed a few days. We've learned at least as much, in the same amount of time, and it sticks. Again, cramming works fine in a pinch. It just doesn't last. Spacing does. Yes, this kind of approach takes planning, nothing is entirely free. Still, spaced-out study is as close to a freebie as anything in learning science, and very much worth trying. Pick the subject area wisely. Remember, spacing is primarily a retention technique. Foreign languages, science vocabulary, names, places, dates, geography, memorizing speeches. Having more facts on board could very well help with comprehension, too, and several researchers are investigating just that, for math as well as other sciences. For now, though, this is a memorization strategy. The sensually educated William James, who became the philosopher dean of early American psychology, was continually doling out advice about how to teach, learn, and remember. Here he is, though, in his 1901 book Talks to Teachers on Psychology, and to Students on Some of Life's Ideals, throwing out a whiff of the spacing effect. Cramming seeks to stamp things in by intense application before the ordeal. But a thing thus learned can form few associations. On the other hand, the same thing recurring on different days in different contexts, read, recited, referred to again and again, related to other things and reviewed, gets well wrought into mental structure. After more than 100 years of research, we can finally say which days those are. Chapter 5. The Hidden Value of Ignorance. The Many Dimensions of Testing. At some point in our lives, we all meet the student who tests well without trying. I have no idea what happened, says she, holding up her 99% score. I hardly even studied. It's a type you can never entirely escape, even in adulthood, as parents of school-aged children quickly discover. I don't know what it is, but Danielle just scores off the charts on these standardized tests, says Mom, dumbfounded, at school pickup. He certainly doesn't get it from me. No matter how much we prepare, no matter how early we rise, there's always someone who does better with less, who magically comes alive at game time. I'm not here to explain that kid. I don't know of any study that looks at test-taking as a discrete, standalone skill, or any evidence that it is an inborn gift, like perfect pitch. I don't need research to tell me that this type exists. I've seen it too often with my own eyes. I'm also old enough to know that being jealous isn't any way to close the gap between us and them. Neither is working harder. No, the only way to develop any real test-taking mojo is to understand more deeply what, exactly, testing is. The truth is not so self-evident, and it has more dimensions than you might guess. The first thing to say about testing is this: disasters happen. To everyone. Who hasn't opened a test booklet and encountered a list of questions that seem related to a different course altogether? I have a favorite story about this, a story I always go back to in the wake of any collapse. The teenage Winston Churchill spent weeks preparing for the entrance exam into Harrow, the prestigious English boys' school. He wanted badly to get in. On the big day, in March of 1888, he opened the exam and found, instead of history and geography, an unexpected emphasis on Latin and Greek. His mind went blank, he wrote later, and he was unable to answer a single question. I wrote my name at the top of the page. I wrote down the number of the question, 1. After much reflection I put a bracket round it, thus, ... but thereafter I could not think of anything connected with it that was either relevant or true. Incidentally, there arrived from nowhere in particular a blot and several smudges. I gazed for 2 whole hours at this sad spectacle, and then merciful ushers collected up my piece of fool's cap and carried it up to the headmaster's table. And that's Winston Churchill. The next thing to say is less obvious, though it's rooted in a far more common type of blown test. We open the booklet and see familiar questions on material we've studied, stuff we've highlighted with yellow marker, names, ideas, formulas we could recite with ease only yesterday. No trick questions, no pink elephants, and still we lay an egg. Why? How? I did so myself on one of the worst possible days, a trigonometry final I needed to ace to get into an advanced placement course, junior year. I spent weeks preparing. Walking into the exam that day, I remember feeling pretty good. When the booklets were handed out, I scanned the questions and took an easy breath. The test had a few of the concepts I'd studied, as well as familiar kinds of questions, which I'd practiced dozens of times. I can do this, I thought, yet I scored somewhere in the low 50s, in the very navel of average. Who did I blame? Myself. I knew the material but didn't hear the music. I was a bad test taker. I was kicking myself, but for all the wrong reasons. The problem wasn't that I hadn't worked hard enough, or that I lacked the test-taking gene. No, my mistake was misjudging the depth of what I knew. I was duped by what psychologists call fluency, the belief that because facts or formulas or arguments are easy to remember right now, they'll remain that way tomorrow or the next day. The fluency illusion is so strong that, once we feel we've nailed some topic or assignment, we assume that further study won't help. We forget that we forget. Any number of study aids can create fluency illusions, including highlighting, making a study guide, and even chapter outlines provided by a teacher or a textbook. Fluency misperceptions are automatic. They form subconsciously and make us poor judges of what we need to restudy, or practice again. We know that if you study something twice, in spaced sessions, it's harder to process the material the second time, and so people think it's counterproductive, as Nate Cornell, a psychologist at Williams College, told me. But the opposite is true, you learn more, even though it feels harder. Fluency is playing a trick on judgment, so it is that we end up attributing our poor test results to test anxiety or, too often, stupidity. Let's recall the Bjork's desirable difficulty principle. The harder your brain has to work to dig out a memory, the greater the increase in learning. Fluency, then, is the flip side of that equation. The easier it is to call a fact to mind, the smaller the increase in learning. Repeating facts right after you've studied them gives you nothing, no added memory benefit. The fluency illusion is the primary culprit in below-average test performances. Not anxiety. Not stupidity. Not unfairness or bad luck. Fluency. The best way to overcome this illusion and improve our testing skills is, conveniently, an effective study technique in its own right. The technique is not exactly a recent invention, people have been employing it since the dawn of formal education, probably longer. Here's the philosopher Francis Bacon, spelling it out in 1620, if you read a piece of text through 20 times, you will not learn it by heart so easily as if you read it 10 times while attempting to recite it from time to time and consulting the text when your memory fails. And here's the irrepressible William James, in 1890, musing about the same concept. A curious peculiarity of our memory is that things are impressed better by active than by passive repetition. I mean that in learning, by heart, for example, when we almost know the piece, it pays better to wait and recollect by an effort from within, than to look at the book again. If we recover the words in the former way, we shall probably know them the next time, if in the latter way, we shall very likely need the book once more. The technique is testing itself. Yes, I am aware of how circular this logic appears, better testing through testing. Don't be fooled. There's more to self-examination than you know. A test is not only a measurement tool, it alters what we remember and changes how we subsequently organize that knowledge in our minds. And it does so in ways that greatly improve later performance. One of the first authoritative social registries in the New World was Who's Who in America, and the premiere volume, published in 1899, consisted of more than 8,500 entries, short bios of politicians, business leaders, clergymen, railroad lawyers, and sundry distinguished Americans. The bios were detailed, compact, and historically rich. It takes all of 30 seconds, for example, to learn that Alexander Graham Bell received his patent for the telephone in 1876, just days after his 29th birthday, when he was a professor of vocal physiology at Boston University. And that his father, Alexander Melville Bell, was an inventor, too, an expert in elocution who developed visible speech, a set of symbols used to help deaf people learn to speak. And that his father, Alexander Bell, no middle name, of Edinburgh, pioneered the treatment of speech impediments. Who knew? The two younger Bells, though both were born in Edinburgh, eventually settled in Washington, D.C. The father lived at 1525 35th Street, and the son at 1331 Connecticut Avenue. That's right, the addresses are here, too. In 1917, a young psychologist at Columbia University had an idea. He would use these condensed life entries to help answer a question. Arthur Gates was interested in, among other things, how the act of recitation interacts with memory. For centuries, students who received a classical education spent untold hours learning to recite from memory epic poems, historic monologues, and passages from scripture, a skill that's virtually lost today. Gates wanted to know whether there was an ideal ratio between reading and reciting. If you want to learn Psalm 23 by heart, in, say, a half hour, how many of those minutes should you spend studying the verse on the page, and how many should you spend trying to recite from memory? What ratio anchors that material in memory most firmly? That would have been a crucial percentage to have, especially back when recitation was so central to education. The truth is, it's just as handy today, not only for actors working to memorize Henry V's St. Crispin's Day speech but for anyone preparing a presentation, learning a song, or studying poetry. To find out if such a ratio existed, Gates enlisted 5 classes from a local school, ranging from 3rd to 8th grade, for an experiment. He assigned each student a number of Who's Who entries to memorize and recite. He gave them each 9 minutes to study along with specific instructions on how to use that time. One group would spend 1 minute and 48 seconds memorizing, and 7 minutes, 12 seconds rehearsing. Another would split its time in half, equal parts memorizing and rehearsing. A third, 8 minutes of its time memorizing, and only a minute rehearsing, and so on. 3 hours later, it was showtime. Gates asked each student to recite what he or she could remember of their assigned entries. Edgar Mayhew Bacon, author. Born, June 5, 1855, Nassau, the Bahamas, and went to private schools in Tarrytown, New York, worked in a bookstore in Albany, and then I think became an artist. And then wrote, The New Jamaica. And Sleepy Hollow maybe, one, after another, after another. Edith Wharton. Samuel Clemens. Jane Addams. The brothers James. More than 100 students, reciting. And in the end, Gates had his ratio. In general, he concluded, the best results are obtained by introducing recitation after devoting about 40% of the time to reading. Introducing recitation too early or too late leads to poorer results, Gates wrote. In the older grades, the percentage was even smaller, closer to a third. The superiority of optimal reading and retention over reading alone is about 30%. The quickest way to download that St. Crispin's Day speech, in other words, is to spend the first third of your time memorizing it, and the remaining 2/3 reciting from memory. Was this a landmark finding? Well, yes, actually. In hindsight, it was the first rigorous demonstration of a learning technique that scientists now consider one of the most powerful of all. Yet at the time no one saw it. This was one study, in one group of schoolchildren. Gates didn't speculate on the broader implications of his results, either, at least not in the paper he published in the Archives of Psychology, Recitation as a Factor in Memorizing, and the study generated little scientific discussion or follow-up. The reasons for this, I think, are plain enough. Through the first half of the 20th century, psychology was relatively young and growing by fits and starts, whipsawed by its famous theorists. Freud's ideas still cast a long shadow and attracted hundreds of research projects. Ivan Pavlov's experiments helped launch decades of research on conditioned learning, stimulus-response experiments, many of them in animals. Research into education was in an exploratory phase, with psychologists looking into reading, into learning disabilities, phonics, even the effect of students' emotional life on grades. And it's important to say that psychology, like any science, proceeds in part by retrospective clue gathering. A scientist has an idea, a theory, or a goal, and looks backward to see if there's work to build on, if there's anyone who's had the same idea or reported results that are supportive of it. Science may be built on the shoulders of giants, but for a working researcher it's often necessary to ransack the literature to find out who those giants are. Creating a rationale for a research project can be an exercise in historical data mining, in finding shoulders to build on. Gates's contribution is visible only in retrospect, but it was inevitable that its significance would be noticed. Improving education was, then as now, a subject of intense interest. And so, in the late 1930s, more than 20 years later, another researcher found in Gates's study a rationale for his own. Herbert F. Spitzer was a doctoral student at the State University of Iowa, who in 1938 was trawling for a dissertation project. He wasn't interested in recitation per se, and he didn't belong to the small club of academic psychologists who were focused on studying the intricacies of memory. He was intent on improving teaching methods, and one of the biggest questions hanging over teachers, from the very beginning of the profession, was when testing is most effective. Is it best to give one big exam at the end of a course? Or do periodic tests given earlier in the term make more sense? We can only guess at Spitzer's thinking, because he did not spell it out in his writings. We know he'd read Gates's study, because he cites it in his own. We know, too, that he saw Gates's study for what it was. In particular, he recognized Gates's recitation as a form of self-examination. Studying a prose passage for 5 or 10 minutes, then turning the page over to recite what you can without looking, isn't only practice. It's a test, and Gates had shown that self-exam had a profound effect on final performance. That is to say, testing is studying, of a different and powerful kind. Spitzer understood that, and then asked the next big question. If taking a test, whether recitation, rehearsal, self-exam, pop quiz, or sit-down exam, improves learning, then when is the best time to take it? To try to find out, he mounted an enormous experiment, enlisting 6th graders at 91 different elementary schools in 9 Iowa cities, 3,605 students in all. He had them study an age-appropriate 600-word article, similar to what they might get for homework. Some were assigned an article on peanuts, and others one on bamboo. They studied the passage once. Spitzer then divided the students into 8 groups and had each group take several tests on the passages over the next 2 months. The tests for each group were all the same, multiple choice, 25 questions, each with 5 possible answers. For example, for those who studied bamboo, what usually happens to a bamboo plant after the flowering period? A. It dies. B. It begins a new growth. C. It sends up new plants from the roots. D. It begins to branch out. E. It begins to grow a rough bark. In essence, Spitzer conducted what was, and probably still is, the largest pop quiz experiment in history. The students had no idea that the quizzes were coming, or when, and each group got hit with quizzes at different times. Group 1 got one right after studying, then another a day later, and a third 3 weeks later. Group 6 didn't take their first quiz until 3 weeks after reading the passage. Again, the time the students had to study was identical. So were the questions on the quizzes. Yet the groups' scores varied widely, and a pattern emerged. The groups that took pop quizzes soon after reading the passage, once or twice within the first week, did the best on a final exam given at the end of 2 months, getting about 50% of the questions correct. By contrast, the groups who took their first pop quiz 2 weeks or more after studying scored much lower, below 30% on the final. Spitzer showed not only that testing is a powerful study technique, he showed it's one that should be deployed sooner rather than later. Immediate recall in the form of a test is an effective method of aiding the retention of learning and should, therefore, be employed more frequently, he concluded. Achievement tests or examinations are learning devices and should not be considered only as tools for measuring achievement of pupils. For lab researchers focused on improving retention, this finding should have rung a bell, and loudly. Recall, for a moment, Ballard's reminiscence from Chapter 2. The school children in his wreck of the Hesperus experiment studied the poem only once but continued to improve on subsequent tests given days later, remembering more and more of the poem as time passed. Those intervals between studying the poem and taking the tests, a day later, 2 days, a week, are exactly the ones that Spitzer found most helpful for retention. Between them, Gates and Spitzer had demonstrated that Ballard's young students improved not by some miracle but because each test was an additional study session. Even then, after Spitzer published his findings in the Journal of Educational Psychology, the bell didn't sound. "We can only speculate as to why," wrote Henry Roediger III and Jeffrey Carpick, also then at Washington University, in a landmark 2006 review of the testing effect, as they called it. One possible reason, they argued, is that psychologists were still primarily focused on the dynamics of forgetting. For the purpose of measuring forgetting, repeated testing was deemed a confound, to be avoided. It contaminated forgetting, in the words of one of Spitzer's contemporaries. Indeed it did, and does. And, as it happens, that contamination induces improvements in thinking and performance that no one predicted at the time. More than 30 years passed before someone picked up the ball again, finally seeing the possibilities of what Gates and Spitzer had found. That piece of fool's cap Winston Churchill turned in, with the smudges and blots. It was far from a failure, scientists now know, even if he scored a flat 0. Let's take a breather from this academic parsing of ideas and do a simple experiment, shall we? Something light, something that gets this point across without feeling like homework. I've chosen 2 short passages from one author for your reading pleasure, and pleasure it should be, because they're from, in my estimation, one of the most savage humorists who ever strode the earth, however unsteadily. Brian O'Nolan, late of Dublin, was a long-time civil servant, crank, and pub crawler who between 1930 and 1960 wrote novels, plays, and a much-beloved satirical column for the Irish Times. Now, your assignment, read the 2 selections below, 4 or 5 times. Spend 5 minutes on each, then put them aside and carry on with your chores, and shirking of same. Both come from a chapter called Bores in O'Nolan's book The Best of Miles. Passage 1, The Man Who Can Pack. This monster watches you try to stuff the contents of 2 wardrobes into an attaché case. You succeed, of course, but have forgotten to put in your golf clubs. You curse grimly but your friend is delighted. He knew this would happen. He approaches, offers consolation and advises you to go downstairs and take things easy while he puts things right. Some days later, when you unpack your things in Glengarriff, you find that he has not only got your golf clubs in but has included your bedroom carpet, the kit of the gas company man who has been working in your room, 2 ornamental vases and a card table. Everything in view, in fact, except your razor. You have to wire £7 to Cork to get a new leather bag to get all this junk home. Passage 2, The Man Who Soles His Own Shoes. Quite innocently you complain about the quality of present-day footwear. You wryly exhibit a broken sole. Must take them in tomorrow, you say vaguely. The monster is flabbergasted at this passive attitude, has already forced you into an armchair, pulled your shoes off and vanished with them into the scullery. He is back in an incredibly short space of time and restored your property to you, announcing that the shoes are now as good as new. You notice his own for the first time and instantly understand why his feet are deformed. You hobble home, apparently on stilts. Nailed to each shoe is an inch-thick slab of leather made from shellac, sawdust and cement. Got all that? It's not the fairy queen, but it'll suffice for our purposes. Later in the day, an hour from now, if you're going with the program, restudy passage 1. Sit down for 5 minutes and reread it a few more times, as if preparing to recite it from memory. When the 5 minutes are up, take a break, have a snack, and come back to passage 2. This time, instead of restudying, test yourself on it. Without looking, write down as much of it as you can remember. If it's 10 words, great. 3 sentences? Even better. Then put it away without looking at it again. The next day, test yourself on both passages. Give yourself, say, 5 minutes on each to recall as much as you can. So, which was better? Eyeball the results, counting the words and phrases you remembered. Without being there to look over your shoulder and grade your work, I'm going to hazard a guess that you did markedly better on the second passage. That is essentially the experimental protocol that a pair of psychologists, Karpik, now at Purdue, and Rodiger, have used in a series of studies over the past decade or so. They've used it repeatedly, with students of all ages, and across a broad spectrum of material: prose passages, word pairs, scientific subjects, medical topics. We'll review one of their experiments, briefly, just to be clear about the impact of self-examination. In a 2006 study, Karpik and Rodiger recruited 120 undergraduates and had them study 2 science-related passages, one on the sun and the other on sea otters. They studied one of the 2 passages twice, in separate 7-minute sessions. They studied the other one once, for 7 minutes, and in the next 7-minute session were instructed to write down as much of the passage as they could recall without looking. Each student, then, had studied one passage 2 times, either the sea otters, or the sun, and the other just once, followed by a free recall test on it. Karpik and Rodiger split the students into 3 groups, one of which took a test 5 minutes after the study sessions, one that got a test 2 days later, and one that tested a week later. The results are easily read off the following graph. There are 2 key things to take away from this experiment. First, Karpik and Rodiger kept preparation time equal. The students got the same amount of time to try to learn both passages. Second, the testing prep buried the study prep when it really mattered, on the 1-week test. In short, testing does not equal studying, after all. In fact, testing greater than studying, and by a country mile, on delayed tests. Did we find something no one had ever found before? No, not really, Rodiger told me. Other psychologists, most notably Chizuko Aizawa, had shown similar effects in the 1960s and 70s at Stanford University. People had noticed testing effects and gotten excited about them. But we did it with different material than before, the prose passages, in this case, and I think that's what caught people's attention. We showed that this could be applied to real classrooms, and showed how strong it could be. That's when the research started to take off. Rodiger, who's contributed an enormous body of work to learning science, both in experiments and theory, also happens to be one of the field's working historians. In a review paper published in 2006, he and Karpik analyzed a century's worth of experiments, on all types of retention strategies, and showed that the testing effect has been there all along, a strong, consistent contaminant, slowing down forgetting. To measure any type of learning, after all, you have to administer a test. Yet if you're using the test only for measurement, like some physical education push-up contest, you fail to see it as an added workout, itself making contestants' memory muscles stronger. The word testing is loaded, in ways that have nothing to do with learning science. Educators and experts have debated the value of standardized testing for decades, and reforms instituted by President George W. Bush in 2001, increasing the use of such exams, only inflamed the argument. Many teachers complain of having to teach to the test, limiting their ability to fully explore subjects with their students. Others attack such tests as incomplete measures of learning, blind to all varieties of creative thinking. This debate, though unrelated to work like Karpik and Rodiger's, has effectively prevented their findings and those of others from being applied in classrooms as part of standard curricula. When teachers hear the word testing, because of all the negative connotations, all this baggage, they say, "We don't need more tests, we need less." Robert Bjork, the UCLA psychologist, told me, in part to soften this resistance, researchers have begun to call testing retrieval practice. That phrase is a good one for theoretical reasons, too. If self-examination is more effective than straight studying, there must be reasons for it. One follows directly from the Bjork's desirable difficulty principle. When the brain is retrieving studied text, names, formulas, skills, or anything else, it's doing something different, and harder, than when it sees the information again, or restudies. That extra effort deepens the resulting storage and retrieval strength. We know the facts or skills better because we retrieved them ourselves, we didn't merely review them. Rodiger goes further still. When we successfully retrieve a fact, he argues, we then restore it in memory in a different way than we did before. Not only has storage levels spiked, the memory itself has new and different connections. It's now linked to other related facts that we've also retrieved. The network of cells holding the memory has itself been altered. Using our memory changes our memory in ways we don't anticipate, and that's where the research into testing takes an odd turn indeed. What if you somehow got hold of the final exam for a course on day one, before you'd even studied a thing? Imagine it just appeared in your inbox, sent mistakenly by the teacher. Would having that test matter? Would it help you prepare for taking the final at the end of the course? Of course it would. You'd read the questions carefully. You'd know what to pay attention to and what to study in your notes. Your ears would perk up any time the teacher mentioned something relevant to a specific question. If you were thorough, you'd have memorized the correct answer to every item before the course ended. On the day of that final, you'd be the first to finish, sauntering out with an A+ in your pocket. And you'd be cheating. But what if, instead, you took a test on day one that was comprehensive but not a replica of the final exam? You'd bomb the thing, to be sure. You might not be able to understand a single question, and yet that experience, given what we've just learned about testing, might alter how you subsequently tune into the course itself during the rest of the term. This is the idea behind pre-testing, the latest permutation of the testing effect. In a series of experiments, psychologists like Rodiger, Karpik, the Bjorks, and Cornell have found that, in some circumstances, unsuccessful retrieval attempts, i.e., wrong answers, aren't merely random failures. Rather, the attempts themselves alter how we think about, and store, the information contained in the questions. On some kinds of tests, particularly multiple choice, we learn from answering incorrectly, especially when given the correct answer soon afterward. That is, guessing wrongly increases a person's likelihood of nailing that question, or a related one, on a later test. That's a sketchy-sounding proposition on its face, it's true. Bombing tests on stuff you don't know sounds more like a recipe for discouragement and failure than an effective learning strategy. The best way to appreciate this is to try it yourself. That means taking another test. It'll be a short one, on something you don't know well. In my case, let's make it the capital cities of African nations. Choose any 12 and have a friend make up a simple multiple-choice quiz, with 5 possible answers for each nation. Give yourself 10 seconds on each question. After each one, have your friend tell you the correct answer. Ready? Put the smartphone down, close the computer, and give it a shot. Here are a few samples. Botswana, Gaborone, Dar es Salaam, Hargeisa, Oran, Zaria, Ghana, Uambo, Benin, Accra, Maputo, Kumasi, Lesotho, Lusaka, Juba, Maseru, Cotonou, N'Djamena, and so on. You've just taken a test on which you've guessed, if you're anything like me, mostly wrong. Has taking that test improved your knowledge of those 12 capitals? Of course it has. Your friend gave you the answers after each question. Nothing surprising there. We're not quite done, though. That was phase 1 of our experiment, pre-testing. Phase 2 will be what we think of as traditional studying. For that, you will need to choose another 12 unfamiliar nations, with the correct answer listed alongside, and then sit down and try to memorize them. Nigeria, Abuja. Eritrea, Asmara. Gambia, Banjul. Take the same amount of time, 2 minutes, as you took on the multiple choice test. That's it. You're done for the day. You have now effectively studied the capital cities of 24 African nations. You studied the first half by taking a multiple choice pre-test. You studied the other half the old-fashioned way, by straight memorization. We're going to compare your knowledge of the first 12 to your knowledge of the second 12. Tomorrow, take a multiple choice test on all 24 of those nations, also with 5 possible choices under each nation. When you're done, compare the results. If you're like most people, you scored 10 to 20% higher on the countries in that first group, the ones where you guessed before hearing the correct answer. In the jargon of the field, your unsuccessful retrieval attempts potentiated learning, increasing successful retrieval attempts on subsequent tests. In plain English, the act of guessing engaged your mind in a different and more demanding way than straight memorization did, deepening the imprint of the correct answers. In even plainer English, the pretest drove home the information in a way that studying as usual did not. Why? No one knows for sure. One possible explanation is that pretesting is another manifestation of desirable difficulty. You work a little harder by guessing first than by studying directly. A second possibility is that the wrong guesses eliminate the fluency illusion, the false impression that you knew the capital of Eritrea because you just saw or studied it. A third is that, in simply memorizing, you saw only the correct answer and weren't thrown off by the other 4 alternatives, the way you would be on a test. Let's say you're studying capitals and you see that Australia's is Canberra, Robert Bjork told me. Okay, that seems easy enough. But when the exam question appears, you see all sorts of other possibilities, Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, and suddenly you're not so sure. If you're studying just the correct answer, you don't appreciate all the other possible answers that could come to mind or appear on the test. Taking a practice test provides us something else as well, a glimpse of the teacher's hand. Even when you get wrong answers, it seems to improve subsequent study, Robert Bjork added, because the test adjusts our thinking in some way to the kind of material we need to know. That's a good thing, and not just for us. It's in the teacher's interest, too. You can teach facts and concepts all you want, but what's most important, in the end, is how students think about that material, how they organize it, mentally, and use it to make judgments about what's important and what's less so. To Elizabeth Bjork, that seemed the best explanation for why a pretest would promote more effective subsequent studying. It primes students to notice important concepts later on. To find out, she decided to run a pretesting trial in one of her own classes. Bjork decided to start small, in her Psychology 100B class at UCLA, on research methods. She wouldn't give a comprehensive pre-final on the first day of class. It was a pilot study, really, and I decided to give the pretests for 3 individual lectures, she said. The students would take each pretest a day or 2 before each of those lectures. We wanted to see whether they remembered the material better later. She and Nicholas Söderstrom, a postdoctoral fellow, designed the 3 short pretests to have 40 questions each, all multiple choice. They also put together a cumulative exam to be given after the 3 lectures. The crucial question they wanted to answer was, do students comprehend and retain pretested material better and longer than they do material that's not on a pretest but is in the lectures? To answer that, Bjork and Söderstrom did something clever on the final exam. They filled it with 2 kinds of questions, those that were related to the pretest questions and those that were not. If pretesting helps, then students should do better on related questions during a later exam than on material we covered in the lectures but was not pretested, Bjork said. This is analogous to the African nation test we devised above. The first 12 capitals were pretested, the second 12 were not. They were studied in the usual way. By comparing our scores on the first 12 to the second 12, on a comprehensive test of all 24, we could judge whether pre-testing made any difference. Bjork and Söderström would compare students' scores on pre-test related questions to their scores on non-pre-tested ones on the cumulative final. The related questions were phrased differently but often had some of the same possible answers. For example, here's a pair of related questions, one from the pre-test and the next from the cumulative exam. Which of the following is true of scientific explanations? A. They are less likely to be verified by empirical observation than other types of explanations. B. They are accepted because they come from a trusted source or authority figure. C. They are accepted only provisionally. D. In the face of evidence that is inconsistent with a scientific explanation, the evidence will be questioned. E. All of the above are true about scientific explanations. Which of the following is true of explanations based on belief? A. They are more likely to be verified by empirical observation than other types of explanations. B. They are accepted because they come from a trusted source or authority figure. C. They are assumed to be true absolutely. D. In the face of evidence that is inconsistent with an explanation based on belief, the belief will be questioned. E, B and C above. The students tanked each pre-test. Then they attended the relevant lecture a day or two later, in effect, getting the correct answers to the questions they just tried to answer. Pre-testing is most helpful when people get prompt feedback. Did those bombed tests make any difference in what the students remembered later? The cumulative exam, covering all three pre-tested lectures, would tell. Bjork and Söderström gave that exam 2 weeks after the last of the 3 lectures was presented, and it used the same format as the others, 40 multiple-choice questions, each with 5 possible answers. Again, some of those exam questions were related to pre-test ones and others were not. The result? Success. Bjork's Psych 100B class scored about 10% higher on the related questions than on the unrelated ones. Not a slam dunk, 10%, but not bad for a first attempt. The best way you could say it for now, she told me, is that on the basis of preliminary data, giving students a pre-test on topics to be covered in a lecture improves their ability to answer related questions about those topics on a later final exam. Even when students bomb a test, she said, they get an opportunity to see the vocabulary used in the coming lectures and get a sense of what kinds of questions and distinctions between concepts are important. Pretesting is not an entirely new concept. We have all taken practice tests at one time or another as a way of building familiarity, and to questionable effect. Kids have been taking practice SATs for years, just as adults have taken practice as MCATs and GMATs and LSATs. Yet the SAT and tests like it are general knowledge exams, and the practice runs are primarily about reducing anxiety and giving us a feel for format and timing. The research that the Bjorks, Rodiger, Cornell, Karpik and others have done is different. Their testing effect, pre- or post-study, applies to learning the kind of concepts, terms, and vocabulary that form a specialized knowledge base, say of introductory chemistry, biblical analysis, or music theory. In school, testing is still testing. That's not going to change, not fundamentally. What is changing is our appreciation of what a test is. First, thanks to Gates, the Columbia researcher who studied recitation, it appeared to be at least equivalent to additional study. Answering does not only measure what you remember, it increases overall retention. Then, testing proved itself to be superior to additional study, in a broad variety of academic topics, and the same is likely true of things like music and dance. Practicing from memory. Now we're beginning to understand that some kinds of tests improve later learning, even if we do poorly on them. Is it possible that one day teachers and professors will give pre-finals on the first day of class? Hard to say. A pre-final for an intro class in Arabic or Chinese might be a wash, just because the notations and symbols and alphabet are entirely alien. My guess is that pre-finals are likely to be much more useful in humanities courses and the social sciences, because in those courses our minds have some scaffolding of language to work with, before making a guess. At this point, We don't know what the ideal applications of pretesting are, Robert Bjork told me. It's still a very new area. Besides, in this book we're in the business of discovering what we can do for ourselves, in our own time. Here's what I would say, based on my conversations with the Bjorks, Roediger, and others pushing the limits of retrieval practice, testing, recitation, self-examination, pretesting, call it what you like, is an enormously powerful technique capable of much more than simply measuring knowledge. It vanquishes the fluency trap that causes so many of us to think that we're poor test takers. It amplifies the value of our study time. And it gives us, in the case of pretesting, a detailed, specific preview of how we should begin to think about approaching a topic. Testing has brought fear and self-loathing into so many hearts that changing its definition doesn't come easily. There's too much bad blood. Yet one way to do so is to think of the examination as merely one application of testing, one of many. Those applications remind me of what the great Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges once said about his craft: writing long books is a laborious and impoverishing act of foolishness, expanding in 500 pages an idea that could be perfectly explained in a few minutes. A better procedure is to pretend that those books already exist and to offer a summary, a commentary. Pretend that the book already exists. Pretend you already know. Pretend you already can play something by Sabicas, that you already inhaled the street, Crispin's day speech, that you have philosophy logic nailed to the door. Pretend you already are an expert and give a summary, a commentary, pretend and perform. That is the soul of self-examination, pretending you're an expert, just to see what you've got. This goes well beyond taking a quick peek at the summary questions at the end of the history chapter before reading, though that's a step in the right direction. Self-examination can be done at home. When working on guitar, I learn a few bars of a piece, slowly, painstakingly, then try to play it from memory several times in a row. When reading through a difficult scientific paper, I put it down after a couple times through and try to explain to someone what it says. If there's no one there to listen, I say it out loud to myself, trying as hard as I can to quote from the paper its main points. Many teachers have said that you don't really know a topic until you have to teach it, until you have to make it clear to someone else. Exactly right. One very effective way to think of self-examination is to say, okay, I've studied this stuff, now it's time to tell my brother, or spouse, or teenage daughter what it all means. If necessary, I write it down from memory. As coherently, succinctly, and clearly as I can. Remember, these apparently simple attempts to communicate what you've learned, to yourself or others, are not merely a form of self-testing, in the conventional sense, but studying, the high-octane kind, 20 to 30% more powerful than if you continued sitting on your butt, staring at that outline. Better yet, those exercises will dispel the fluency illusion. They'll expose what you don't know, where you're confused, what you've forgotten, and fast. That's ignorance of the best kind. Part 3, Problem Solving. Chapter 6. The Upside of Distraction. The Role of Incubation in Problem Solving. School hits us with at least as many psychological tests as academic ones. Hallway rejection. Playground fights. Hurtful gossip, bad grades, cafeteria food. Yet at the top of that trauma list, for many of us, is the stand-up presentation, being on stage in front of the class, delivering a memorized speech about black holes or the French Resistance or Piltdown Man, and wishing that life had a fast-forward button. I'm not proud to admit it, but I'm a charter member of that group. As a kid, I'd open my mouth to begin a presentation and the words would come out in a whisper. I thought I'd moved beyond that long ago, until early one winter morning in 2011. I showed up at a middle school on the outskirts of New York City, expecting to give an informal talk to a class of 20 or 30 seventh graders about a mystery novel I'd written for kids, in which the clues are pre-algebra problems. When I arrived, however, I was ushered onto the stage of a large auditorium, a school staffer asking whether I needed any audio-visual equipment, computer connections, or PowerPoint. No. I sure didn't. The truth was, I didn't have a presentation at all. I had a couple of books under my arm and was prepared to answer a few questions about writing, nothing more. The auditorium was filling fast, with teachers herding their classes into rows. Apparently, this was a school-wide event. I struggled to suppress panic. It crossed my mind to apologize and exit stage left, explaining that I simply wasn't ready, there'd been some kind of mistake. But it was too late. The crowd was settling in and suddenly the school librarian was on stage, one hand raised, asking for quiet. She introduced me and stepped aside. It was showtime. And I was 11 years old again. My mind went blank. I looked out into a sea of young faces, expectant, curious, impatient. In the back rows I could see kids already squirming. I needed time. Or a magic trick. I had neither, so I decided to start with a puzzle. The one that came to mind is ancient, probably dating to the Arab mathematicians of the 7th century. More recently, scientists have used it to study creative problem solving, the ability to discover answers that aren't intuitive or obvious. It's easy to explain and accessible for anyone, certainly for middle school students. I noticed a blackboard toward the back of the stage, and I rolled it up into the light. I picked up a piece of chalk and drew 6 vertical pencils about 6 inches apart, like a row of fence posts. This is a very famous puzzle, and I promise, any of you here can solve it, I said. Using these pencils, I want you to create 4 equilateral triangles, with 1 pencil forming the side of each triangle. I reminded them what an equilateral triangle is, one with 3 equal sides. So, 6 pencils. 4 triangles. Easy, right? Go. The fidgeting stopped. Suddenly, all eyes were on the blackboard. I could practically hear those mental circuits humming. This is what psychologists call an insight problem, or more colloquially, an aha problem. Why? Because your first idea for a solution usually doesn't work. So you try a few variations. And get nowhere. And then you stare at the ceiling for a minute. And then you switch tacks, try something else. Feel blocked again. Try a totally different approach. And then, aha, you see it. An insight problem, by definition, is one that requires a person to shift his or her perspective and view the problem in a novel way. The problems are like riddles, and there are long-running debates over whether our ability to crack them is related to IQ or creative and analytical skills. A knack for puzzles doesn't necessarily make someone a good math, chemistry, or English student. The debate aside, I look at it this way, it sure doesn't hurt. We need creative ways of thinking to crack any real problem, whether it's in writing, math, or management. If the vault door doesn't open after we've tried all our usual combinations, then we've got to come up with some others, or look for another way in. I explained some of this in the auditorium that morning, as the kids stared at the board and whispered to one another. After 5 minutes or so, a few students ventured up to the blackboard to sketch out their ideas. None worked. The drawings were of triangles with smaller triangles crisscrossing inside, and the sides weren't equal. Solid efforts all around, but nothing that opened the vault door. At that point, the fidgeting started again, especially in the back rows. I continued with more of my shtick about math being like a mystery, that you need to make sure you've used all available information. That you should always chase down what seem like your stupidest ideas. That, if possible, you should try breaking the problem into smaller pieces. Still, I felt like I was starting to sound to them like the teachers in those old Charlie Brown movies, and the mental hum in the room began to dissipate. I needed another trick. I thought of another well-known insight problem and wrote it on the board beneath the chalk pencils. Sequence. Okay, let's take a break and try another one, I told them. Your only instruction for this one is to complete the sequence using any letter other than E. I consider this a more approachable puzzle than the triangle one, because there's no scent of math in it. The sequence puzzle is one we all feel we can solve. I hoped not only to keep them engaged but also to draw them in deeper, put them in the right frame of mind to tackle the pencil problem. I could feel the difference in the crowd right away, too. There was a competitive vibe in the air, as if each kid in that audience sensed that this one was within his or her grasp and wanted to be the first to nail it. The teachers began to encourage them as well. Concentrate, they said. Think outside the box. Quiet, you guys in the back. Pay attention. After a few more minutes, a girl near the front raised her hand and offered an answer in a voice that was barely audible, as if she was afraid to be wrong. She had it right, though. I had her come up to the board and fill in the answer, generating a chorus of "Oh man. And you're kidding me, that's it?" Such are insight problems, I told them. You have to let go of your first ideas, re-examine every detail you're given, and try to think more expansively. By this time I was in the fourth quarter of my presentation and still the pencil problem mocked them from the board. I had a couple hints up my sleeve, waiting for deployment, but I wanted to let a few more minutes pass before giving anything away. That's when a boy in the back, the pay attention district, raised his hand. "What about the number 4 and a triangle?" he said, holding up a diagram on a piece of paper that I couldn't make out from where I was standing. I invited him up, sensing he had something. He walked onto the stage, drew a simple figure on the board, then looked at me and shrugged. It was a strange moment. The crowd was pulling for him, I could tell, but his solution was not the generally accepted one. Not even close. But it worked. So it is with the investigation into creative problem solving. The research itself is out of place in the lab-centric world of psychology, and its conclusions look off base, not in line with the usual advice we hear, to concentrate, block distractions, and think. But they work. What is insight, anyway? When is the solution to a problem most likely to jump to mind, and why? What is happening in the mind when that flash of X-ray vision reveals an answer? For much of our history, those questions have been fodder for poets, philosophers, and clerics. To Plato, thinking was a dynamic interaction between observation and argument, which produced forms, or ideas, that are closer to reality than the ever-changing things we see, hear, and perceive. To this, Aristotle added the language of logic, a system for moving from one proposition to another. The jay is a bird, and birds have feathers, thus, the jay must have feathers, to discover the essential definitions of things and how they relate. He supplied the vocabulary for what we now call deduction and induction. The very foundation of scientific inquiry. In the 17th century, Descartes argued that creative problem solving required a retreat inward, to an intellectual realm beyond the senses, where truths could surface like mermaids from the deep. This kind of stuff is a feast for late-night dorm room discussions, or intellectual jousting among doctoral students. Its philosophy, focused on general principles and logical rules, on discovering truth and essential properties. It's also perfectly useless for the student struggling with calculus, or the engineer trying to fix a software problem. These are more immediate, everyday mental knots, and it was an English intellectual and educator who took the first steps toward answering the most relevant question: what actually happens when the mind is stuck on a problem, and then comes unstuck? What are the stages of solving a difficult problem, and when and how does the critical insight emerge? Graham Wallas was known primarily for his theories about social advancement, and for co-founding the London School of Economics. In 1926, at the end of his career, he published The Art of Thought, a rambling meditation on learning and education that's part memoir, part manifesto. In it, he tells personal stories, drops names, reprints favorite poems. He takes shots at rival intellectuals. He also conducts a wide-ranging analysis of what scientists, poets, novelists, and other creative thinkers, throughout history, had written about how their own insights came about. Wallas was not content to reprint those self-observations and speculate about them. He was determined to extract a formula of sorts, a specific series of steps that each of these thinkers took to reach a solution, a framework that anyone could use. Psychologists at the time had no language to describe these steps, no proper definitions to work with, and thus no way to study this most fundamental human ability. To Wallas, this was appalling. His goal was to invent a common language. The raw material Wallace cites is fascinating to read. For example, he quotes the French mathematician Henri Poincaré, who had written extensively about his experience trying to work out the properties of a class of forms called fusion functions. Often when one works at a hard question, nothing good is accomplished at the first attack, Poincaré had observed. Then one takes a rest, longer or shorter, and sits down anew to the work. During the first half hour, as before, nothing is found, and then all of a sudden the decisive idea presents itself to the mind. Wallace also quotes the German physicist Hermann von Helmholtz, who described how new ideas would bubble up after he'd worked hard on a problem and hit a wall. Happy ideas come unexpectedly, without effort, like an inspiration, he wrote. So far as I am concerned, they have never come to me when my mind was fatigued, or when I was at my working table. They came particularly readily during the slow ascent of wooded hills on a sunny day. The Belgian psychologist Julian Varendonck traced his insights to daydreaming after a period of work, sensing that there is something going on in my foreconsciousness which must be in direct relation to my subject. I ought to stop reading for a little while and let it come to the surface. None of these quotes is especially informative or illuminating by itself. Read too many of them, one after another, without the benefit of expertise in the fields or the precise calculations the person is working out, and they begin to sound a little like post-game comments from professional athletes. I was in the zone, man, I felt like I was seeing everything in slow motion. Wallace saw, however, that the descriptions had an underlying structure. The thinkers had stalled on a particular problem and walked away. They could not see an opening. They had run out of ideas. The crucial insights came after the person had abandoned the work and was deliberately not thinking about it. Each insight experience, as it were, seemed to include a series of mental steps, which Wallace called stages of control. The first is preparation, the hours or days, or longer, that a person spends wrestling with whatever logical or creative knot he or she faces. Poincaré, for example, spent 15 days trying to prove that fusion functions could not exist, an extensive period of time given his expertise and how long he'd played with the ideas before sitting down to construct his proof. Every day I seated myself at my work table, stayed an hour or two, tried a great number of combinations and reached no result, he wrote. Preparation includes not only understanding the specific problem that needs solving and the clues or instructions at hand, it means working to a point where you've exhausted all your ideas. You're not stalled, in other words. You're stuck, ending preparation. The second stage is incubation, which begins when you put aside a problem. For Helmholtz, incubation began when he abandoned his work for the morning and continued as he took his walk in the woods, deliberately not thinking about work. For others, Wallace found, it occurred overnight, or during a meal, or when out with friends. Some mental machinations were clearly occurring during this downtime, Wallace knew, and they were crucially important. Wallace was a psychologist, not a mind reader, but he ventured a guess about what was happening. Some kind of internal mental process, he wrote, is operating that associates new information with past information. A type of internal reorganization of the information seems to be going on without the individual being directly aware of it. That is to say, the mind works on the problem offline, moving around the pieces it has in hand and adding one or two it has in reserve but didn't think to use at first. One way to think of this is in terms of a weekend handiwork project. There you are, for example, replacing an old, broken door handle and casing with a new one. It looks like an easy job, but there's a problem: the casing sits off-center, the bolt and latch don't line up right. You don't want to cut new holes, that'll ruin the door. You futs and see it's not going to happen. You give up and break for lunch, and suddenly think, wait, why not use the old casing, put the new hardware in that? You threw the old casing away and suddenly remembered you still had it, in the garbage. That's the general idea, at least, and in Wallace's conception, incubation has several components. One is that it's subconscious. We're not aware it's happening. Another is that the elements of the problem are being assembled, taken apart, and reassembled. At some point past information, perhaps knowledge about the properties of triangles we hadn't initially recalled, is braided in. The third stage of control is called illumination. This is the aha moment, the moment when the clouds part and the solution appears all at once. We all know that feeling, and it's a good one. Here's Poincaré again, on the fusion functions problem, giving up its secrets. One evening, contrary to my custom, I drank black coffee and could not sleep. Ideas rose in crowds, I felt them collide until pairs interlocked, so to speak, making a stable combination. By the next morning, I had only to write out the results. The fourth and final stage in the paradigm is verification, checking to make sure those results, indeed, work. Wallace's principal contribution was his definition of incubation. He did not see this as a passive step, as a matter of the brain resting and returning fresh. He conceived of incubation as a less intense, subconscious continuation of the work. The brain is playing with concepts and ideas, pushing some to the side, fitting others together, as if absent-mindedly working on a jigsaw puzzle. We don't see the result of that work until we sit down again and notice an entire corner of the jigsaw puzzle is now complete, revealing a piece of the picture that then tells us how to work with the remaining pieces. In a sense, the letting go allows people to get out of their own way, giving the subconscious a chance to toil on its own, without the conscious brain telling it where to go or what to do. Wallace didn't say how long incubation should last. Nor did he specify what kinds of downtime activity, walks, naps, bar hopping, pleasure reading, cooking, were best. He didn't try to explain, in scientific terms, what might be happening in our brains during incubation, either. The goal wasn't to lay out a research agenda, but to establish a vocabulary, to discover how far the knowledge accumulated by modern psychology can be made useful for the improvement of the thought processes of a working thinker. He expressed a modest hope that his book could induce others to explore the problem with greater success than my own. He had no idea. The subsequent study of creative problem solving was not your typical white-coated lab enterprise. In the early days, in fact, it was more like shop class. To study how people solve problems, and to do so rigorously, psychologists needed to devise truly novel problems. This wasn't easy. Most of us grow up on a steady diet of riddles, jokes, wordplay, and math problems. We have a deep reservoir of previous experience to draw on. To test problem solving in the purest sense, then, scientists needed something completely different, ideally, not academic at all. So they settled on puzzles that demanded the manipulation not of symbols but of common household objects. As a result, their labs looked less like labs than your grandfather's garage. One of the more inventive of these shop-class labs belonged to the University of Michigan psychologist Norman Maier, who was determined to describe the mental machinations that directly precede seeing a solution. In a 1931 experiment, Maier recruited 61 participants and brought them into a large room one at a time. Inside, each participant found tables, chairs, and an assortment of tools, including several clamps, a pair of pliers, a metal pole, and an extension cord. 2 ropes hung from the ceiling to the floor, one in the middle of the room and the other about 15 feet away next to a wall. Your problem is to tie the ends of those 2 ropes together, they were told. The participants quickly discovered that it wasn't possible to grab one rope and simply walk over and grab the other, it didn't reach far enough. Maier then explained that they were free to use any object in the room, in any manner they chose, to tie the 2 together. The puzzle had 4 solutions, some more obvious than others. The first was to tie one rope to a chair and then walk the other rope over. Maier put this in the easy category. He considered 2 others slightly more difficult: tie the extension cord to one of the ropes to make it long enough to reach, or use the pole to pull one rope to the other. The 4th solution was to swing the rope in the middle of the room like a pendulum and catch it as it neared the wall. Maier considered this the most advanced solution, because in order to make it happen you had to tie something heavy to the rope so it would swing far enough. After 10 minutes, 40% of the students had landed on all 4 solutions without any help. But it was the remaining 60% that Maya was interested in, those who got at least one of the possibilities but not the hardest one, the weighted pendulum. At the 10-minute mark, they were stumped. They told Maya they'd run out of ideas, so he gave them a few minutes break. In Wallace's terminology, these students were incubating, and Maya wanted to figure out what exactly was happening during this crucial period of time. Did the fourth solution appear as a completed whole? Or did it reveal itself in stages, growing out of a previous idea? To find out, Maya decided to nudge the stumped students in the direction of the pendulum solution himself. After the break, he stood up and walked toward the window, deliberately brushing against the rope in the center of the room, causing it to swing ever so slightly, taking care to do so in full sight of the participants. Within 2 minutes, almost all of the participants were creating a pendulum. When the experiment was over, Maya asked them how they arrived at the fourth answer. A few said that they'd had a vague notion to move the ropes somehow, and the hint simply completed the thought. The solution appeared to them in stages, that is, and Maya's nudge made it click. Nothing new in that, we've all been there. Think of the game show Wheel of Fortune, where each letter fills in a blank of a common phrase. We feel ourselves nearing a solution, letter by letter, and know exactly which letter lights the lamp. The rest of the group's answers, however, provided the real payoff. Most said that the solution appeared in a flash, and that they didn't get any hints at all, even though they clearly had. I just realized the cord would swing if I fastened a weight to it, one said. The solution came from a previous physics class, said another. Were these participants just covering their embarrassment? Not likely, Maya argued. The perception of the solution of a problem is like the perceiving of a hidden figure in a puzzle picture, he wrote. The hint was not experienced because the sudden experience of the solution dominated consciousness. Put another way, the glare of insight was so bright, it obscured the factors that led to it. Maya's experiment is remembered because he'd shown that incubation is often, perhaps entirely, subconscious. The brain is scanning the environment, outside of conscious awareness, looking for clues. It was Maya who provided that clue in this experiment, of course, and it was a good one. The implication, however, was that the incubating brain is sensitive to any information in the environment that might be relevant to a solution, the motion of a pendulum clock, a swing set visible through the window, the swaying motion of the person's own arm. Life is not always so generous with hints, clearly, so Maya hadn't completely explained incubation. People routinely generate creative solutions, when no clues are available at all, with their eyes closed, in basement study rooms, in tucked-away cubicles. Successful incubation, then, must rely on other factors as well. Which ones? You can't ask people what they are, because the action is all off-stage, and there's no easy way to pull back the curtain. But what if you, the scientist, could block people from seeing a creative solution, in a way that was so subtle it went unnoticed? And what if you could also discreetly remove that obstacle, increasing the odds that the person saw the answer? Would that reveal anything about this hidden incubation? Is it even possible? A young German psychologist named Karl Duncker thought so. Duncker was interested in how people became unblocked when trying to crack a problem requiring creative thinking, too, and he'd read Maya's study. In that paper, remember, Maya had concluded, the perception of the solution of a problem is like the perceiving of a hidden figure in a puzzle picture. Duncker was familiar with picture puzzles. While Maya was conducting his experiments, Duncker was studying in Berlin under Max Wertheimer, one of the founders of the Gestalt school of psychology. Gestalt, shape, or form in German, theory held that people perceive objects, ideas, and patterns whole, before summing their component parts. For example, to construct a visual image of the world, i.e., to see, the brain does a lot more than piece together the patches of light streaming through the eyes. It applies a series of assumptions: objects are cohesive, surfaces are uniformly colored, spots that move together are part of the same object. These assumptions develop early in childhood and allow us to track an object, a baseball, say, when it disappears momentarily in the glare of the sun, or to recognize a scattering of moving spots behind a thicket of bushes as our lost dog. The brain fills in the form behind the bushes, which in turn affects how we perceive the spots. Gestalt psychologists theorized that the brain does similar things with certain types of puzzles. That is, it sees them as a whole, it constructs an internal representation, based on built-in assumptions. When I first saw the pencil problem, for instance, I pictured an equilateral triangle on a flat plane, as if drawn on a piece of paper, and immediately began arranging the remaining pencils around that. My whole life, I'd worked geometry problems on paper. Why should this be any different? I made an assumption, that pencils lay in the same plane, and that representation determined not only how I thought about possible solutions, it also determined how I interpreted the given instructions. Many riddles exploit just this kind of automatic bias. 1. Dunker suspected that Gestalt-like biases, those mental representations, could block people from seeing solutions. His innovation was to create puzzles with built-in, and removable, curtains, using everyday objects like boxes, boards, books, and pliers. The best known of these was the so-called candle problem. In a series of experiments, Dunker had subjects enter a room, alone, that contained chairs and a table. On this table were a hammer, a pair of pliers, and other tools, along with paper clips, pieces of paper, tape, string, and small boxes filled with odds and ends. One contained thumbtacks, another contained small candles, like you'd see on a birthday cake, others had buttons, or matches. The assignment: fasten 3 of the candles to the door, at eye height, so they could be lighted, using anything from the table. Each participant was given 10 minutes to complete the assignment. Most tried a few things, like pinning the candles to the door with the tacks, or fastening them with tape, before stalling out. But Dunker found that the success rate shot way up if he made one small adjustment, taking the tacks, matches, and other items out of the boxes. When the boxes were sitting on the table, empty, subjects saw that they could fasten those to the door with tacks, creating mini platforms on which to mount the candles. Dunker hadn't changed the instructions or the available materials one bit. Yet by emptying the boxes, he'd altered their mental representation. They were no longer merely containers, incidental to the problem at hand, they were seen as available for use. In Dunker's terminology, when the boxes were full, they were functionally fixed. It was as if people didn't see them at all. This idea of fixedness infects our perceptions of many problems we encounter. We spend 5 minutes rifling through drawers searching for a pair of scissors to open a package when the keys in our pocket could do the job just as well. Mystery novelists are virtuosos at creating fixed ideas about characters, subtly prompting us to rule out the real killer until the last act. Fixedness is what makes the sequence puzzle a puzzle at all. We make an automatic assumption that the symbol represents an empty space, a platform for a letter, and it's hard to shake that assumption precisely because we're not even aware that we've made it. Dunker ran comparison trials with all sorts of puzzles similar to the candle problem and concluded, under our experimental conditions, the object which is not fixed is almost twice as easily found as the object which is fixed. The same principle applies, to some extent, in Mayer's pendulum experiment. Yes, the people trying to solve that problem first had to think of swinging the rope. Then, however, they had to devise a way to swing the rope far enough, by attaching the pliers. The pliers are pliers, a tool for squeezing things, until they become a weight for the pendulum. Until they become unfixed. Between them, Mayer and Dunker had discovered 2 mental operations that aid incubation, picking up clues from the environment, and breaking fixed assumptions, whether about the use of pliers, or the gender of a doctor. Here's the rub: they had demonstrated those properties by helping their stumped subjects along with hints. Most of us don't have a psychologist on call, ready to provide desk-side incubation assistance whenever we're stuck. We've got to make it happen on our own. The question is, how? You're shipwrecked. You swim and swim until finally you wash up on a desert island, a spit of sand no more than a mile around. As you stagger to your feet and scan the coastline, you realize, you've read about this place. It's the Isle of Pukul, famous for its strange caste system. Members of the highest caste never tell the truth, members of the lowest always do, and those in the middle are sometimes honest and sometimes not. Outwardly, the castes are indistinguishable. Your only chance of survival is to reach the 100-foot Tower of Insight, a holy site of refuge where you can see for miles and send out a distress signal. You follow a winding footpath and arrive at the one intersection on the island, where 3 Pukulians are lounging in the heat. You have 2 questions to ask to find your way to that tower. What do you ask? I like this puzzle for several reasons. It captures the spirit of insight in a visceral way, for one. At first glance, it seems hairy. It echoes a famous problem in math logic, involving 2 guards and a man-eating lion too, yet absolutely no math expertise is required. If anything, math expertise is likely to get in the way. A 5-year-old can solve it. Better still, we can use it as a way to think about the most recent research on incubation and problem solving, which has branched out like a climbing vine since its duct tape and thumbtack days. To review, Wallace's definition of incubation is a break that begins at